For our final project, we decided to do an analysis of the California Police Scorecard data. The police scorecard is made up of data from the years 2016 to 2018 and is related to police department policies and actions, as well as subsequent scoring determined by Campaign Zero in all 58 of California's counties. Campaign Zero is a project of the nonprofit organization We the Protesters. The goal of the organization is to mitigate police violence and invest funding for use in other social projects. The data set that we were provided with came with 3 tables: a police demographic table, a police arrest table, and a police accountability table. And we were examining and analyzing the data set in order to formulate and test a hypothesis about possible racial disparities in policing and develop a prediction model to determine relationships between police funding and the performance of police departments, and therefore make recommendations from such. The key variables that we were looking at were the overall score, which is computed as the average of police violence score, police accountability, and approach to policing.
So for our hypothesis test, we wanted to find whether there is a disparity between drug arrest rates between different races. Our null hypothesis was that the distribution of drug arrests between races is similar to the population distribution between races, and our alternative hypothesis was that these distributions were not similar.
During our initial exploratory analysis of the data, we found that there were some disparities between actual demographic makeups in California versus the information that was presented. In particular, if you look at the Hispanic population, they're vastly underrepresented in the data set that we were provided with.
To perform our hypothesis test, first we need to make a table to display the population proportion versus the drug arrest proportion between races. In the table, we can see that our alternative hypothesis has merit, as the proportion of Hispanic drug arrests are much higher than their respective population proportion, while Black and Asian/Pacific Islander arrests are much lower. To determine whether the difference shown in the previous slide is significant, we perform a multiple categories hypothesis test. Our statistic is the total variation distance between the population distribution and drug arrest distribution, which helps us measure whether the difference between distributions is based on random chance or not. We use a cutoff p-value of 0.05, and we implement our test using the model of random selection. After performing the test, we create a histogram to visualize our data on the right. As you can see, since our observed statistic is 0.388, which is much larger than the shown values on the histogram, our p-value is 0 and we reject the null. There is evidence to suggest that there are statistically significant differences between drug arrest and population proportions between races, which suggests possible racial bias in drug arrest. However, since we found that the initial demographic data may be incorrect, this leads to possible bias and may invalidate our data altogether.
For our prediction problem, we wanted to answer the question of whether or not a police agency's budget can actually be used to predict its overall score. And the model we choose to study this relationship is a linear regression.
To tackle our prediction problem, we first created a scatter plot to visualize the data and see whether there was a relationship between the log of police budget and overall score. As shown in the plot, there seems to be a moderately negative linear association, and we can expect our model to do relatively well.
We furthered this research by also looking at the percent budget spend from counties on the police, and we aggregate this data into a table, collecting all of the percentage breakdowns into bins and converting the letter grade or the numerical scores to letter grade so they're more easily readable. Quite notable is the large proportion of police departments that have failing grades.
From our linear regression model, we can see that there is a negative linear association between the log of police budget and the overall score, and our correlation coefficient was negative 0.401. Our findings suggest that the more money a county spends on their police budget, the lower their overall score, and vice versa. Although correlation does not imply causation, this may encourage counties to reduce police budget spending in order to try to increase performance. So although our correlation is still moderately low at negative 0.04, we can see that our linear regression model is appropriate as our residual plot shows no pattern. However, the standard deviation of our residuals is relatively high at 0.124, so our model is not the most accurate.
In conclusion, we found that there actually were differences in arrest rates between different racial groups. We also found that there was a negative correlation between the budget of a police department and its overall score. As mentioned, this may encourage counties to divest funding in the police and instead spend more on other social projects. Lastly, we unfortunately found that there was a fallacious information present in our data set. Specifically, the demographics provided were quite different from the true representations of the communities. We suspect this may lead to flawed analysis and results.